Hi, friends. Welcome back. I have some exciting news to share with you today. Your opportunity to learn fertility awareness with me is here. Registration for Fertility Awareness Mastery Live is now open. We're starting in May. This is my 10-week group coaching program for women who want to balance hormones, boost progesterone, banish PMS, eliminate period pain, optimize fertility, all the things, and more. But what makes this unique is that we're doing it through the power of cycle charting. FAM Live teaches you to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. You'll leave this program not only with a solid understanding of the symptothermal method for birth control and conception, but with a completely new relationship with your body and your cycles. We keep the group small so that we can better support each of you, so spaces are limited. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAM. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 463. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with over 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormone health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I have been consistently outspoken about hormonal birth control over the past 2 decades and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys and a brand new baby girl. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today, I'm sharing a brand new episode in my Pill Reality series. I'm sharing a fascinating interview with Amanda. She is a member of the Fertility Friday community, and she reached out to me several months ago to share her experience coming off the pill. And what was really interesting about her message and our conversation today is that she had a series of tests done because she came off the pill to try to conceive, and she was testing her ovarian reserve parameters. So her tests included AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And what's interesting is that she tested those levels a month after coming off the pill, and then a few months later and a few months later. And so we have this interesting progression of what these parameters looked like immediately after coming off the pill all the way up to a year out. And what's interesting about it is that the results didn't surprise me. I spoke about this link between the pill and its effects on ovarian reserve parameters in the Fifth Vital Sign. So if you have the book already, you could have a look through chapter 8 for a detailed description of that. I go over some interesting research that looks at this exact issue. And of course, chapter 7 of the Fifth Vital Sign is all about the most common side effects on birth control. So if you haven't yet grabbed a copy of the Fifth Vital Sign, it's worthwhile, especially if you're interested in these topics, because it's something that isn't talked about a whole lot. So I think you're in for a really interesting conversation today. I feel like, especially if you've personally had an experience regarding this type of testing and been told whether it's that you can't conceive naturally because your AMH is too low or whatever the case is, if it's been used in that way to describe your ability to conceive, I feel like today's episode is going to be of particular interest and importance to you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So I'm really excited to be here today with Amanda. I think that this episode, I'm really excited about this episode, and it came about in an interesting way. I do get a lot of emails, but your email really stood out to me. You shared your experience coming off the pill, and you shared a whole bunch of interesting data that we're going to get into about how your AMH changed from when you first came off to a certain duration of time. And I guess, long story short, this episode puts a very practical face to a lot of the data and stats that I've talked about on the podcast over the years, and that we've talked about, that I wrote about in the Fifth Vital Sign, of how the pill can affect fertility and how it can take a little bit of time for things to normalize afterwards and all of that. So I really do appreciate you for coming on the show today and sharing your story. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, yeah, thank you again. I mean, we were chit-chatting so much in the pre-chat that I had to stop us and hit record. I feel like we have so much to talk about today. But I think where I like to start with these pill reality episodes is I'd love for you to just lead us into your story. And my favorite question is, how old were you when you had your first period? What was that like? When did you go on the pills? Or I think it was the pill that you used specifically, but you could share with us a little bit about the contraceptives and what your experience was like on them and kind of what led you to where you are at now.
Sure. I think my period started when I was 13, although I didn't write it down anywhere. I don't have an exact date, but I think I remember it was 13. And I didn't go on the pill right away, but I went on it a few years later, primarily because of acne. My mom had been on the pill before, my older sister had been on the pill. And when I had quite a lot of acne as a teenager, going on the pill was sort of a natural step. It seems that a lot of women are recommended to take that step. And it was kind of one step toward getting on Accutane, which is a major acne medication, which I wanted to be on, and many of my friends were on, and they had this beautiful skin. And my mom said she refused to let me get on it, which I'm thankful for now. But at the time, I was thinking, why can't I have this beautiful skin that my friends have? My mom's reasoning was, in order to get on Accutane, dermatologists will make you get on birth control first, because of the potential harm that Accutane could cause to a baby. And my mom said, well, if it can cause such harm to a baby, couldn't it cause that much harm to your body as well? Of course, now I understand that there are many medications that practically all medications women cannot be on when they're pregnant. So perhaps the logic there was a little faulty, but I am thankful now that I never went on Accutane and that it stopped at the level of birth control. After that, I was kind of on and off birth control for many years. So perhaps for close to 20 years. I'm 39 now. I went off the pill at 38 to try to get pregnant. And so I've been kind of on and off it for 20 years.
Okay, well, I think just to touch on the Accutane, my understanding, at least, is that part of the issue with Accutane is the high level of synthetic vitamin A. I think I'd have to double check on that. And so it's a specific thing where vitamin A, if you are not pregnant, doesn't do bad things to you. But if you are pregnant, the synthetic vitamin A can have a negative teratogenic effect on the baby. So just as a kind of interesting aside on that one, where that's one of those cases where it's worthwhile always for any medication to look up the side effects and things like that. And obviously it makes a lot of sense, the logic of like, if this is bad for the baby, I shouldn't be taking it. It is helpful to look at kind of like, that's kind of going into the weeds though. But I think I often use Accutane as one of those examples of like, yeah, it would be bad. Like there's no pregnancy when you're taking Accutane. But an interesting point though for your mom to know that, to say if they put you on Accutane, they're also going to put you on the pill. And that's interesting because for some women, the pill, because it basically shuts down your normal hormone production. For some women, the pill itself gets rid of the acne. And so many women are put on the pill for acne. So it's interesting that they would like double it up. It's a whole thing, right? I feel like that's why we're here.
Right. And I did have better skin when I was on birth control, although by the time I finally went off it at 38, my skin was great anyway. So I didn't need to be on it for that, probably for many years already. And also, I guess I'll say that I wasn't sexually active until well into my 20s. So going on birth control as a teenager, I don't remember exactly when, maybe 15, 16, 17, was really quite unnecessary for me. And it taught me very young that the birth control pill is the way and the only way and the best way to prevent pregnancy, which I now see, now that I see that the effect it has on the body, I realize that's not really the case.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. I often have, especially nowadays, I do feel like we're in a similar age bracket, you and I. You're about a year younger than me.
Okay.
But I think that they say where this line or whatever, like our age is like kind of that line between millennial and whatever the other thing is. So I don't know. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but like, so people my age, they're like, I don't consider myself a millennial, but I'm kind of on the cusp, like the tail, like the very beginning of when that became a thing. And what I find is that there's a difference between myself and then that younger generation below me. And I think a big part of it is how the conversation around birth control shifted. So that would have been around the year 2000.
Oh, okay.
So that's been my experience of it. So when I was a kid growing up in the 90s, and you may have had a similar experience, it was all like, if you have sex, you'll get AIDS and die. This was my sex education. I don't know if this is yours. This was mine. And they were focused on condoms. And so in my sex education, they really did push condoms hard because of the AIDS problem. So I left high school not actually thinking that the pill was the only way to prevent pregnancy. I left high school thinking condoms were necessary all the time. Obviously, the AIDS question and the other STIs. So the STI thing was like big in the 90s. People still have STIs, like FYI. This whole thing with no condoms is really freaking me out. But I feel like there was a distinct shift to pill only. Pill, pill, pill. Everyone needs to be on the pill. If you're not on the pill, you're going to get pregnant. I feel like that's a huge shift somewhere around that time.
I actually came from a very religious purity culture. So my sex education was much less than what you had, even, it sounds like.
And I went to a Catholic school.
Oh, I went to a public school, but I was very influenced at that time by my church and my very religious family. So I certainly entered my 20s not knowing what I needed to know.
Yeah, and you're not the only one. I feel like even in the Pill Reality series, I've interviewed a number of different women from a number of different backgrounds, and I feel like that's also quite common. But I suppose where it led you to was the pill. So it's really interesting to hear that that was how you felt about it. Like that was the only way to do it. So while you were on the pill, so a lot of the women in the series had issues with the pill, but obviously not everybody does. So during that 20-ish years that you were taking the pill, did you notice anything? Did it affect you in any way that you can remember, or did you feel pretty good on it? Did you ever have to switch to different pills, or were you kind of on the same one the whole time, or how did that work for you?
I actually did not notice too many obvious symptoms of problematic side effects of being on the pill. Like I said, I kind of went on and off it. I think the longest stretch I was on it was probably 7 years. Other than that, I think I would be on it for acne for a little while and then come off, or on it because I had met someone new and then went back off it. And I kind of, after a while, took myself on and off it. Oh, so I haven't experienced too many symptoms, though I'm willing to admit that I probably experienced side effects that I just was not aware of at the time. And I'm certainly aware that many women have extreme side effects. I have noticed in the past couple of months that being off the pill, I've noticed that my hair is growing like below or past the hairline. I mean, like the opposite of a receding hairline. It's advancing hairline. And I feel like that's probably an effect of being off the pill now for 1 year and 5 months. I've been off the pill at this point, and I don't know that for sure, but given what I've heard about the way that the pill takes nutrients away from your body, I would bet that my improving hair probably has something to do with that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and question for you. So it sounds like, I mean, I have two questions, but it sounds like generally your experience wasn't particularly negative on the pill. It sounds like it was okay. And so then question out of that is you did go on and off it sometimes. Was the what was the rationale? I'm just curious. Was it kind of like, I don't really need it right now? Or was there more than that?
It was really, I don't need it right now. And I think I realized early on that if you went to a gynecologist and said, I want to be on the pill, they'll put you on it. They won't ask too many questions. They'll just put you back on it again. So whenever I felt like I needed it, like if I was going to be sexually active again, I would get back on it. And that actually became easier when I moved to a country where you don't actually need a prescription to pick up birth control. So in the past 5 years, basically, I've been able to essentially prescribe it to myself by just going to the pharmacy and getting more of it, or using packs that I never used from the past. So that's what I've been able to do recently.
That is so interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. And then you had commented that there were certain things that maybe you noticed now. You mentioned the hair thing. Were there any other things that you now notice that you think could have been related?
Well, one thing I'm really thankful to have discovered is I had been diagnosed with HPV and had it for 2.5 years, basically, until I went off the pill and then happened to have some more testing done at my gynecologist's office. And after having it that I knew of for 2.5 years, suddenly it was gone. And I just thought, well, great, my immune system has cleared this virus. It's amazing. I've been waiting 2.5 years for this to disappear. And it was only your podcast, actually, that taught me the reason that my HPV disappeared was that it is a clear link to coming off of hormonal birth control and clearing that virus. And beyond fertility, I think that's a really important fact that women need to know, that because HPV can lead to cervical cancer, and indeed I had the primary type that they say leads to cervical cancer, and women need to know that getting off the birth control is perhaps the main way of clearing that virus out of the body. So that's another major thing, that if I hadn't stopped to try to conceive, who knows how many years I would have had that virus, and if it would have progressed to a point where I would have had to have cervical surgery or something like that.
Mm-hmm. The cervical dysplasia thing is certainly a big topic, and I'll link to this podcast some of the previous episodes that I've done on it. Yeah, it's a whole thing. I'll have to do one of those research episodes on some of those studies that I was referencing in the fifth vital sign. And I just feel to comment on it briefly, which is that sometimes when I would post this link between the pill and HPV, I would get someone out of the woodwork like, "You idiot! It's a virus, right? Like the pill doesn't cause HPV, right? Like, so people will be like, you're so dumb." But like I know that it's a virus. So exactly what you said, the pill is linked to deficiency of folate. Folate does seem to be very crucial for cervical health. It seems to play a really fundamental role. But beyond that, somehow between the folate and possibly the change in immune function, women who are on the pill for a really long time are more likely to have the persistent infection, like you said. So it obviously doesn't give you the infection, but it just makes your body less able to fight it. So then it ends up kind of being there for longer and causing more problems, leading to a higher rate of the development of the abnormal cells. So that's a thing. In your case, it's great that when you came off, it cleared on its own. And I think that does happen for a percentage of women. For others, it doesn't necessarily work just like that. So some women do need additional steps to help to clear that and to reverse that and reduce that. And so like I said, I'll link a couple episodes and I'll do some follow-up episodes to talk about that a little bit more because I have talked about those in other places. And then if anyone has a fifth vital sign, I talk about that specific problem and clearing cervical dysplasia and steps to doing that in chapter 11 of the fifth vital sign. And it's to do with replenishing that folate and even possibly doing some vitamin A and stuff like that. So the good news is that there are strategies that can really help that. So public service announcement over. I had one other question, and then I want to go into the fertility aspect of your story. And so you went on and off, and I feel like I did that too. For the short time that I took the pill, I would go on and off it occasionally. For me, it was a little bit different. I had gone on it to help me with my painful period, so I would come off of it because I thought I was fixed, and then the period would come back and be painful again, and then I was like, oh, okay. So even though I didn't know how to describe it, I did know that the pill was doing something different than what my body was doing, right?
Mm.
So when you would come off of the pill, did you ever have any issues? Like, did your cycle just come back normally, or how did that work?
Actually, yeah, my cycles have come back normally every time I've come off the pill. And the last time I came off it to try to conceive, I think I probably ovulated immediately because about a month or so after coming off of the pill, I started tracking my BBT and basal body temperature. And that is kind of what led me into finding out more about fertility awareness and charting. And so I think as soon as the second month off of birth control, my BBT confirmed that I was ovulating. So I'm thankful for that. And I understand that many women don't get periods and ovulation back immediately. So I'm very thankful that it seemed to come back. Mm-hmm. And I think also one of the reasons that I continued to come back to the birth control pill again and again was that I actually saw that consistency of almost no transition from pill periods to off pill periods, that it seemed to follow a pretty consistent structure. So that's also probably why I didn't realize the effects it was having sooner.
Mm-hmm. Well, and theoretically, that is how it's supposed to work. So there's a couple things that I'll just point out about your story in particular, because we do have some research that's sometimes a little harder to come by. So who would be at a greater risk of having a delay in the return of their cycles, at least? And so women typically who have gone through that puberty maturation of the cycle. So if you did not go on the pill within the first 2 to 3 years, basically, of having your period. So in your case, you did go on it at least a little bit after, like it sounds like at least 2-ish, maybe years to maybe a little bit more. So that's something, because when you did have that natural kind of period of time that your cycles need to kind of normalize, and also for women who were put on the pill for a different reason, like who were not put on the pill because they had irregular cycles or because they didn't know where their cycles were coming. So, or women who went on the pill legitimately for birth control, right? So there's some women who had normal cycles, no problems. They weren't put on the pill immediately after they had their first cycle or whatever. And in that case, those women are more likely, like in your case, to have the kind of normal resumption of their cycles when they come off, regardless of how long they've taken it. And I've seen that. I've had clients who've been on the pill for like 18 years, but they went on it like, years after their first period. Their cycles are pretty normal. They didn't have any underlying issues. So it is helpful to point out that the pill doesn't cause you to have cycle problems, but the problem is that it can mask it, although it does obviously cause certain issues, which we'll get into. So share with us then your experience. You came off of the pill, obviously, last year sometime in order to conceive specifically. So maybe just take us through what your experience was like.
Well, one of the first things I did when I was coming off the pill and my husband and I decided to try for a baby was I went to the doctor for a preconception checkup, which I now realize is a total joke for someone coming off of birth control, because a preconception checkup for such a person, at least in my experience, will show you results that are not based in reality, are not based in your actual natural hormonal production. And in my case, I started I got these hormone tests done as part of this preconception checkup, and it kind of set me on a path of anxiety, fear, expecting that I would not be able to get pregnant, because one of the first data points that we had that I was asked to do a test for was FSH. And my very first FSH number was 20.03 on a scale in which doctors tend to say that anything over 10 is unlikely to become pregnant naturally. So I had a number of 20. And my doctor looked at that result and said, "You're probably going to need donor eggs." So that's how I started trying to get pregnant, was being told I would probably need donor eggs.
Well, and I want to jump in for a second, because I want to put this into context, because you sent these results in an email to me, and you suggested, which I think is a really good suggestion, that we will put the results in the show notes. So all of these numbers that we're talking about, if you're listening to the episode, you'll be able to go and have a look at them if you actually want to look at them, and because it's kind of hard to follow in this context here. So this was 1 month off of birth control, meaning that the FSH was too high. And for anyone who doesn't understand what FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. It's a hormone that's released from the pituitary gland towards the beginning of the menstrual cycle. And basically, you can think of it as the hormone that is nudging the ovaries towards ovulation. It's the follicle stimulating. So it's trying to support the follicular development in the follicular phase and move that follicle, that egg, towards ovulation. So when you are in a normal scenario, normal cycle, as the FSH is released, and then your body responds to it, and the egg starts to develop and everything works great, right? So in a normal scenario, but coming off the pill 1 month, you're in a transition phase. So I refer to that as the post-pill transition phase. And so the ovaries are not always as receptive to the FSH. So having a high FSH 1 month off birth control does not mean the same thing as a woman who has high FSH in general. These things are not the same. And they also tested your AMH. So I'll let you, I guess, did you mention the AMH at the 1 month mark?
Not yet. At the 1 month mark, the AMH was 0.13 on a scale of, well, they say that over 1 is the preferred number to try to get pregnant naturally, or on using IVF. And so that number was extremely low for me.
Mm-hmm. And so AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, is also a really interesting marker. They use the AMH in combination with other ovarian reserve markers to basically tell a woman an estimate of her remaining fertility potential. So when they say ovarian reserve markers, they're using these to estimate how many eggs you have left and to therefore predict when you're going to go into menopause. And there's so much here, but without going on a huge tangent, it's so interesting because when you look at the research on AMH, so AMH is produced by the developing follicles throughout the menstrual cycle, and the amount of the AMH is based on the so every time you start a new cycle, you have this little pool of follicles that start to develop. And that little pool of follicles, out of that little pool, one of the follicles in a typical cycle is then chosen to become the dominant, and one goes on to ovulate. So that little pool of follicles is related to the total amount that you have left. So what happened is the researchers discovered that there's a correlation between the size of that little pool of follicles and however many eggs you have left. Because over time, if you were to look at the AMH levels of any individual person from age, whatever it is, you could say from menarche to menopause, there's a general decline. So there is a correlation. So, and the AMH is kicked out by those little follicles. So there's this correlation between how many eggs are in that little pool and how much AMH that you're showing. Okay, so that's kind of the basics. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we're following along. So then as you get older, there's a smaller amount left, and so we have a smaller pool, and so there's this correlation. However, It's not a direct correlation. The AMH provides an indirect measure of this reserve, and it's never an actual measure. We don't open a woman out, cut up her ovaries, and count the eggs. So we can never get a specific number. It is always an estimate. And I feel that the way that AMH is treated in practice often by many health professionals as though it's set in stone. And so it's treated as though there's never any variation in AMH for any reason. So when you get an AMH number that's low, they're going to say, oh, well, you can't have babies. So all of that is the background. So in your case, you came off the pill and they tested your FSH and they tested the AMH, and it was 1 month off birth control. Now, if we look in the research, there's an interesting thing that the birth control pill does to AMH. So the birth control pill suppresses ovulation. It shuts down ovarian function. And so if you were to test a woman on the pill, she's on the pill right now, you test her, sorry for anyone listening who's on the pill, but it's the truth. If you test a woman on the pill, her AMH is going to be low. Her ovarian volume, which is part of how they measure the ovarian reserve, is going to be small. So literally, like this is one of the scary stats that came out of the Fifth Vital Sign that makes people beside themselves. So when a woman is on the pill, her ovaries, the ovarian volume is 50% lower. So her ovaries shrink, like the size of the ovary shrinks to like 50% of the size.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So so literally the volume of the ovary shrinks. It's like it shrivels. That's terrifying. It's not permanent. So it's a hard thing to say because people really freak out, but it's a real thing. It's true. And if you look at the research, that's what it consistently shows. So we have a situation where a woman is on the contraceptive, it suppresses ovarian function, and it basically puts her into a temporary chemical menopause. Now, they don't put that on the package because that's not a good selling point, but that's what's happening. So when you're on the pill, shrinks the ovaries, and your ovarian reserve parameters then are limited. And it's only because they're kind of dormant. Like they're in the state of like they're not doing anything. Like that's why it works. That's why it's such an effective method of birth control. That's the selling point. It stops you from ovulating, can't get pregnant, but this is how it does it, right? So when you're on the pill, the AMH would be low. The ovaries are tiny, and there's these different things. And this is well known.
Mm-hmm. But when I asked the doctor, especially in reference to the FSH, because I think I got the FSH tested a few days or weeks before the AMH, and the doctor said, I asked the doctor because I was beside myself when she told me that this FSH number would mean you're going to need donor eggs. I said, is there any possibility that the fact that I only came off of birth control 1 month ago has given me this FSH? And her answer was, we couldn't possibly know that. It's possible, yes. It's also possible, no. You're going to have to test a few months later, and that will tell you. And certainly my FSH was better a few months later, but it still wasn't quite the true number, even a few months later. The doctor also said at that time that the FSH cannot be changed. There's nothing that can change it. And I have since heard and read stories of women who had poor FSH that had nothing to do with birth control, and through various lifestyle changes, they were able to completely reverse that number. Another thing that doctor told me at that time was, your FSH is determined by your maternal grandmother. And so any women who also have the same maternal grandmother as you, they would be able to, like, their fertility story would help to indicate to you what yours might be. And I thought, well, that's actually great because there are two people in the world who have the same maternal grandmother as I do. My sister had no trouble conceiving two children accidentally in her 20s. And my cousin conceived a baby also accidentally when she was about 41. So I thought, well, I'm 38. My cousin had a baby when she was 41. If that's true that your FSH comes from your maternal grandmother, then I'm probably okay. But at the time, you can just imagine that I was floored and really terrified the way that I started trying to conceive with those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I hear things like that and I just think, can I see the study on that? Like, what? I mean, huh? It was gonna, I mean, I'm not saying there couldn't be any truth to having similarities to your mother or your grandmother, but I mean, come on, So yeah, so this is what's interesting. So if we kind of like cut to the chase here, what was really, really interesting about your experience is that you did end up testing your FSH level at a variety of times as well as the AMH. So you tested 1 month off birth control, 3 months off birth control, 9 months off birth control, and 12 months off birth control. And ironically, your results don't surprise me at all. It's just really interesting to be able to see this progression. And so just to put it into context again, when you study the pill and when you study the result or the effect that the pill has on the ovarian reserve parameters. So there's a study that I cited in the fifth vital sign. I was mentioning it to you, and it's a fertility preservation study. And so basically they have women who are wanting to freeze their eggs. And so they have these women come off birth control. And what they did was they tested their ovarian reserve parameters right off the pill. And then I don't remember, I don't have the study in front of me, but they tested it right off the pill in your case, but they also did a similar thing to you where they tested it then again. And they tested potentially monthly until it got to the point that it didn't really change a whole lot. And so what they found was that right off the pill, the ovarian reserve parameters were not great. What's interesting about ovarian reserve parameters is that they tell what the research and again, this is very consistent in the research. What the research consistently tells us is that a woman's AMH marker or her, FSH marker, well, let's focus on the AMH more specifically. So the AMH marker in particular, it tells a woman and tells the doctor how likely the IVF extraction is likely to be successful. So in the research, the published, and you don't have to, this is not an obscure study. This is all, this is a very consistent result. But AMH is most useful at predicting IVF success. So specifically, if you have IVF and your AMH is too low, you will not get as many eggs. If you get IVF and your AMH is normal, good within the range, then you will get more eggs. If the AMH is way too high, so for example, women with PCOS who have multiple follicles, right? Too much follicles, too many, right? Polycystic ovary, they will have way too many follicles in that pool and put out way too much AMH. And then they run the risk of overstimulation, meaning too many eggs. And they actually have this condition that can be very harmful. So here we go. Even another situation where AMH can be different and it has nothing to do with the preserve, right? So basically, this is what it's actually most useful for. And when they do studies on a woman's AMH level and how likely she is to conceive naturally, the results show us that there's really not a consistent, useful correlation there. So, because women with undetectable AMH have conceived. So we have a situation where we have a mismatch between the research and the practice, where the research actually tells us that AMH by itself should not be used to tell women whether or not they can conceive naturally, but that's what happens. And The truth is that AMH is actually, like in the research again, from the horse's mouth, from all the studies, most useful at predicting IVF success.
And the doctor writes a diagnosis of diminished ovarian reserve or premature ovarian insufficiency based on this AMH number, from what I understand. That's what happened with me, that as soon as I got those results 1 month after birth control, I was given this diagnosis of diminished ovarian reserve. And psychologically, it just has a major impact on you when you already came into the doctor's office fearing that you're too old. At least in my case, at 38, that's what I was thinking. And it has a major psychological effect on, and probably has an effect on your ability to get pregnant as well.
Because there's an actual word for it. It's called the nocebo effect. But yes, because it would increase the stress. Because doctors in our culture are kind of celebrated as gods or something. And so for better or for worse, when the doctor gives you a diagnosis, it really does affect how we feel about it. I mean, there's studies on that. The doctor tells someone they're going to die in 3 months. A certain percentage of people die in 3 months, right? Like on the nose. And so it's a real powerful, unfortunate scenario. Just like they say placebo is like when you think something good's going to happen and it affects you, the nocebo is the opposite, right? So it's just not great. So to kind of wrap up what I was saying about this fertility preservation study, so it's so interesting because these women who were coming off the pill to freeze their eggs, the research showed that right off the pill, obviously, as we've been discussing, those ovarian reserve parameters are suppressed. And the researchers found that over a period of 6 to 7 months after, the ovarian reserve parameters would rebound and then kind of stabilize at that point. And so the researchers then concluded and suggested that the women who are wanting to freeze their eggs come off the pill early to give, because again, if they're freezing the eggs, they need to have a successful IVF stimulation, right? And if the AMH is low, then when they do the IVF stimulation, which is what the AMH is very good at predicting, they're not going to get as many eggs. So it's actually more beneficial, more profitable, right? You see where I'm going with this? For these women to wait the 6 to 7 months so that they can get more eggs from, like, because this is about money. This is about, like, it's obviously like it's about preserving fertility, but at the end of the day, right? Like, this is a business too, where these clinics want to have a successful outcome. Obviously, if fertility preservation isn't free. So the most successful outcome is going to come if these women come off the pill several months in advance so that the AMH can normalize a little bit and whatever. So the irony here, and we talked about this briefly in the pre-chat, is that the results of the study would indicate that if a woman is freezing her eggs, she would be counseled, hopefully, on this, and she would be given the suggestion to come off of it several months early so that everything can normalize and that she'll get a better yield of her eggs. However, when a woman is trying to conceive naturally, typically doctors are not telling her to come off early. You just come off when you're ready and start trying whatever. And those two things just don't seem to match the research. So it's just really, really frustrating. So I'll throw it back to you, but like what the results showed when you did your tests, at the 1 month, 3 month, 9 month, and 12 month, was that by 12 months, your results were pretty much in normal range, completely fine. Jumping into today's episode with some exciting news to share, I am beyond excited to offer the next round of Fertility Awareness Mastery live next month. We've been working behind the scenes to create an incredible experience for all of you. This is your opportunity to balance hormones, boost progesterone, banish PMS, eliminate period pain, optimize fertility, and so much more through the power of cycle charting. You'll leave this program not only with a solid understanding of the symptothermal method for birth control and conception, but with a completely new relationship with your body and your cycles. This program combines group coaching with individualized one-to-one support, giving you the support that you need to solve your period problems. I've been refining and improving this program for over 7 years. We've created an incredible experience that you won't get anywhere else. We keep the group small so we can better support each of you, so spaces are limited. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAM. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode.
Let me just add to the previous conversation. It's amazing to think that I spent the greater part of 20 years being terrified that if I missed a single day of a pill, that I would get pregnant when I didn't want to be. Just in hindsight, it's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, this is a hard conversation. Like I'm so thankful that you and I are able to talk about this, because there's all these things that come up when you talk about this. I mean, if you were to talk, I would imagine that if you were to talk to certain healthcare professionals, they get kind of thorny when you start talking about the pill and this kind of thing, because they'll say, well, you're discouraging women to use it. You're going to scare people away from using it, and women need birth control, which is true. Like, we need to have options, definitely. But we can't be scared off from having this conversation. We need to know what it's doing, and we need to have an understanding of how it can affect the cycle. Because at the end of the day, I always say this, so I'm like a broken record over here. I feel like if we educate women on what the pill's really doing, that there's 3 options typically of how a person can respond. So one, if we tell them, okay, these are the side effects and this is how it could affect fertility or whatever, some women are going to say, okay, well, that's freaking me out, I'm not going to do it at all. But most women, I think, are in the middle. And so at this time, this birth control is still the best option for me. But now that I know that it could take a little while for me for everything to normalize and for these AMH levels and the FSH and the ovarian volume and these things. Like now that I know that it literally takes a minimum of 6 to 7 months for these things to normalize. In your case, they seem to fully normalize about the 12-month mark, which is what I see in the cycles. I tend to see the cycles tend to take about a year before we get everything, normal. So a lot of women would choose to come off of it earlier, opt for a different type of birth control in the meantime, something non-hormonal, so that at least their bodies have a chance. Like women who have the option, women who have the time, I feel like a lot of us would actually make that decision if we had that information, especially if the doctors told us. Could you imagine? We would totally do it. And then there's other women who would take it for just as long. And I feel like we should be given the information so that we can decide which category we're in. And so I, if I hear someone saying like, oh, you scare them off and no. Well, these are the facts. You have the data to prove it too.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, at the end of 12 months coming off of birth control, my AMH was up to 1.25, which is not an amazing number, but it's a pretty good number, and it's high enough to qualify for IVF, I believe, in a lot of cases. And my FSH actually was an even more extraordinary transformation. After 12 months off FSH, my number was 5.9, which is the best data I was able to find online was basically that is much better than the average for a woman of age 33. And I'm 39 by the time I get that number tested, that 5.9 FSH. So, I mean, that makes it seem as if I have FSH perhaps as good as a woman in her late 20s, possibly. And so to go from you're going to need donor eggs to my FSH is better than a woman much younger than me is just amazing. And of course, not every woman would have probably that stark of a transformation, but it's a good message to women that you should not be freaked out by the hormone test results you get while you're still on birth control or when you've just come off of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for the women who I work with, I mean, I would not hesitate to try to educate them on this information. I think sometimes we really want all the data that we can get, right? And it makes perfect sense. When you're trying to conceive, you want to have all the data. But for a client or for a woman who comes off of birth control, I don't feel that those numbers are useful until she's been off of it for at least 6 months. And you could say that about a lot of things, even testing thyroid function. The pill has a mild suppressive effect on the thyroid. And so there's a lot of things where if you test something the month that you came off of contraceptives, that it's not going to reflect the actual situation for you because we're still in that transitional phase. And even just going back to what I said about the pill reducing ovarian volume, so shrinking the ovaries and changing these things, and that being a thing that is consistent in the research. Like we know this. And I can go back into the basics. How does the pill work? Well, the pill suppresses ovulation. And that means that your own estrogen and your own progesterone and your own testosterone production is significantly less. And these are not side effects that affect some people. They're side effects in terms of how the low testosterone will affect you personally. And that's why some women have low libido, whereas others might have painful sex. But everyone across the board has 50% less testosterone. And everybody across the board has profoundly low their own natural estrogen and progesterone because you're not making it, because you're not ovulating. And that's the whole reason why we're taking it. That's the reason why it works, right? So this is I think one of the challenges with having a medication like the birth control pill where so many women take it, but no one's provided with information about how it works. And the most we get is, it makes your body think you're pregnant, or that's the most we get, but we never get an actual explanation of what it's doing in the body, how it's working. Why is it that you can't get pregnant? I mean, ever wonder why? Like, how is it doing that? And if it's doing that, what else is it doing? We should ask more questions. That's why I like doing interviews. Ask all these questions. But yeah, I feel like this is the problem. So many women take it. Most women who take it don't even think of it as a medication. I've often given the example, if you I don't know if this applies to you, but if you've ever been one of those situations where they ask you, like, are you on any medications? A lot of women who are on the pill don't even think to put it down because it's just such a common thing that they don't even think they're taking. So we have no idea what it's doing.
That was me too.
It's a medication.
I would always say no. Well, but birth control, but no.
right? And it's so interesting because it is a medication, and not to throw out the scary stat, but there about 250 to 300 women in the United States die every year from using it as directed, from strokes and stuff. So like, it is a medication, right? So
Never
we
heard
should
that
talk
step
about that.
before.
Yeah, it's terrifying, but it's a real thing that we should discuss. And again, it's not to say no one should use it. I used it. I took it in my teens, so I'm not standing here pretending like I never took it either. I did take it, and I took it to better manage my painful periods. And at the time, I got that desired result. So this is not about judgment. This is about information. So, okay. So now that you're in the midst of this journey, maybe share with us a little bit, because I'm sure, because unfortunately, I feel like we're talking, we're laughing. This is after the fact, but you had to go through a year of this, and the just the trauma of being told that you're going to need donor eggs, and you're not the first person I've talked to. I've talked many clients off of the ledge when their doctors tell them that their AMH level means they're going to have menopause right away and all of this stuff. And as you have clearly experienced for yourself, there are a number of things that can affect AMH. And so it is possible in some cases to improve those numbers, especially if it's low because of a different reason. And so using it as a death sentence to women about they can't get pregnant and stuff like that is not even supported by the research. So it's a really hard topic. And I know how just emotionally just destructive and devastating that can be.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it has been a really traumatic year. And I'm now about 1 year in of trying to conceive. And I keep trying to remind myself that, look, I'm in a better situation than I was a year ago. Even though I'm a year older, I'm in this range where people are constantly talking about your biological clock is ticking like crazy. And so I have to constantly remind myself, even at my age of 39, I'm in a better position than I was a year ago hormonally. And that's just incredibly obvious from the data that I've shared with you. Another factor that has possibly influenced my not being pregnant yet is that I had polyps removed back in October 2022. So that was almost exactly a year after coming off of birth control. And so I think between the polyps and the hormones changing rapidly, I keep trying to remind myself I'm in a better position now, but it has been a really hard year.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And if you were to be able to go back and talk to your younger self, so let's say you had the magical time portal or something, and you were able to talk to even your 25-year-old self, what would you want her, or sorry, 35-year-old self is what I meant to say. What would you want her to know?
I would tell her to get off birth control right away.
Well, and in retrospect, like, do you feel like your 35-year-old self, because you know how, like, there's women listening right now who might be, 25, 28, 32. And for a lot of women, the fear, like, just like with you, the fear that you said, the fear of even missing one pill, right? This is ingrained. So for that woman who's like, I hear what you're saying, but I am terrified. I cannot get pregnant right now. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I don't know. You don't need to have any profound wisdom, but I just want to kind of hear your take on that piece of it too.
Well, I've actually thought of this for myself, assuming that I'm able to have a baby. What would I do afterwards now that I know what I know? And I feel like the only thing that makes sense is fertility awareness charting, which I've never used for birth control. But given what I've heard on your podcast about things like IUDs, insertions of various kinds that may not be hormonal in any way, but cause real physical damage, I just don't know how I could go back to doing a hormonal method or like I said, a physical barrier method that I've never used before, other than condoms, obviously, are barrier methods. But I mean the kind of serious insertions that could damage you physically. I don't see what else there is really other than awareness charting.
Yeah, in terms of the different options. I mean, I'm so, like I said, I keep saying it, but I'm glad that we're having this conversation, for me, it's an interesting role to be in, to have this podcast. I feel like it's such a blessing. I've been saying a lot of the same things for 8 years now. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I listened to my first episode and I realized, I was like, wow, I've been saying the same thing for a long time. And I try to do it in a gentle fashion because it's a very difficult conversation, very nuanced, very complicated. And we all do the best we can with what we know, all of us. So every single woman who goes on the pill, she's doing the best she can with what she knows. Every woman who tries fertility awareness, she's doing the best she can with what she knows. And there's so many competing and conflicting needs that we have. So when you're going on the birth control pill to prevent pregnancy at a time in your life when pregnancy isn't an option, I mean, you are doing the best you can with what you know. And the balance that I try to pull out of this conversation is that when we get to a certain age, this is my opinion now, when we get to a certain age, and in my opinion of what that age is around our 30s, like when we get into our late 20s, early 30s, my opinion is that we should start having that, like we should renegotiate this. So I feel like we should at least have that conversation with ourselves to just ask the question, is this birth control method that I've been using still serving me? Is this still the best option for me now? And experience is basically one of the main reasons. It's because we're not really told how the pill affects our fertility. We're not really told about this temporary period of delayed fertility. It doesn't mean everyone who comes off the pill won't get pregnant. Some women come off the pill and get pregnant right away. We all know that. But others, it takes a little bit of time. But all of the women who come off the pill do have this period of time where their ovarian reserve markers are lower. And particularly when you're older, like when you're over 35, you have two things happening, right? You have the fact that you are older and your fertility naturally does decline a bit as we get older, but you also have this delay. And so you have a scenario where in your case, you're 38, you're coming off of it, your body needed a bit of time, but you don't really have the time, but now you have to wait anyways. And that's very just traumatic and horrible, right? And so this is why I'm so glad we're having this conversation. And I really wish we were having a different conversation. You know, I wish that this wasn't the thing that happened. But I'm also very thankful that you were willing to share your story, because this is what it really looks like. So behind the scenes, when I'm working with clients, your experience, you're not alone. This is what it looks like. And this is what it looks like in a system that's basically failing us every day, where the doctors are not really, it doesn't seem like they're really informed about some of these challenges. It doesn't seem like they're really, talking to their patients in their early to mid 30s and telling them maybe the pill is not, because that's not how they're trained. So from my perspective, again, I just feel like even if the baby thing isn't what you want to do right now, if you had that 1 or 2 years in the future, like, okay, I think in a year or two, we're going to start trying. That's when the pill should, like when you're still avoiding, when you still need birth control, that's when I think you should switch to something non-hormonal. And that's just my opinion. Take it or leave it to try to at least increase those odds.
One thing I really wanted to add was that I did not get any of the really fertile quality cervical mucus until basically exactly when you say that the hormonal parameters return to where they should be. So for me, that cervical mucus first showed up 2 weeks short of a full year off of birth control. And I had been listening to your podcast and others, people talking about this raw egg white quality cervical mucus. And I just couldn't even imagine what that could be, because I had this very watery cervical mucus around ovulation time up until a full year and after coming off of birth control. And once it came, I was really shocked, because the first month it came, it was there for 6 days. The next month, it was actually there for 9 days, which is kind of unbelievable. And I remember reading that at my age, you could expect that quality cervical fertile mucus for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days at most. And when it first came, it was 6 days. And so I hope that hearing that might offer hope to somebody who is listening to this, like me, who is saying, I have no fertile cervical mucus. I'm trying grapefruit juice and Mucinex and evening primrose oil, which I tried all of those things. And they never actually, I think they raised the quantity of watery mucus, but they did not actually turn it into proper fertile cervical mucus. So that's another thing that has corresponded to what you've said, which is that it takes about a year for things to be where they should. And I actually went to my doctor and I told her, is there some kind of like fertility friendly lubricant that you could suggest to me, the best kind that I can buy, because I have no fertile mucus? And she said, well, it's probably not that important because cervical mucus is a secondary fertility sign and doesn't really tell us anything, doesn't really impact your ability to get pregnant. And I just was amazed by that, because even if we forget about the male side of things for a minute, the fact that sperm need somewhere to swim, even if we forget about that, to me, it still just shows how the hormones are not in the place that they need to be for conception. If you're producing none of that fertile level cervical mucus at all.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I'll say that your experience doesn't surprise me, because behind the scenes in my client work, that's what it is. That's very, very typical. Everyone is not the same, but it's very, very typical, especially when you have a person who's been on birth control, on and off or whatever, but for a long time. If a person has used birth control, 10 years, 15 years, it doesn't mean that some women don't come off and see mucus, but it's quite common for it to be limited for a while. I've never seen it where it just never comes back at all, but I've definitely seen periods of time where it's suppressed. And especially, you mentioned that you had the HPV, so that issue is associated also with lower mucus, because your cervix still kind of needs to heal from that. So it's like a little unfortunate trifecta kind of scenario there. And then the fact that the doctor would say that, I think the hard thing when you get into this knowledge of fertility awareness is that we have to recognize that the doctors are not trained about this stuff. They're just not. It's not a thing. It's not part of their training. You can't really go to a doctor and expect them to be experts in fertility awareness charting. So asking your doctor the role of cervical mucus in fertility is kind of like asking McDonald's to like change your tires, like, and be mad at the guy at the counter. And you're just like, well, you should know the gauge of the tire, the weight. And he's like, what are you, do you want to fry? Like, what do you? I think the challenge though is that doctors have healthy egos, so they often talk about things they don't like as if they know, when they really should be saying, this is actually outside of my scope. I feel like if doctors said that more, everything would be better.
Yeah, I agree.
But I'll leave that right there. Well, Amanda, this has been just such a informative conversation. I'm really thankful that we had this time together, and I know that this episode is going to be really powerful and impactful for women listening. I feel like there's just so many tidbits of information to learn, and especially for anyone who's listening who's been given that low AMH, what's the word I'm looking for, sentence, and who's been told that, right, like, you're old, you're gonna go into menopause, you're trying out, like, you may as well, like, right, like all the things that they say. You're not alone, but I know that women who have been told those terrible things by their health professionals, as if there's this direct link between AMH and not being able to conceive naturally, which there isn't, and it's not supported in the research. I really feel that this episode will be a beacon of light for them and others. So, there's hope at the end of the tunnel. And I'll stay in touch with you, and maybe we'll be able to do an update at some point. So we all wish you baby dust and all the good things.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/463. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I feel like it's such an important conversation to have. If you've gathered anything from Amanda's experience going to a variety of doctors, whether it's going to your doctor ahead of time when you're planning to conceive in the near future and you're thinking about coming off the pill ahead of time. I've spoken to countless women who've been told that it doesn't matter, it doesn't make a difference, you shouldn't come off of it early, just come off of it when you're ready to get pregnant. And in her case, she was told that her low AMH levels had nothing to do with the pill and couldn't possibly do anything with the pill and are permanent and unchangeable and are not affected by any other factors. And unfortunately, those pieces of information are just incorrect. It is a good idea when you're planning to conceive to come off of birth control a minimum of 6 to 12 months beforehand. And if you do have a history of long irregular cycles or skipping periods, missing periods, not knowing when they're going to come, then in that specific case, it would be a good idea to consider coming off of contraceptives 18 months to 2 years ahead of time. And the reason for that buffer period is, one, to give your body time to adjust. We talked about on the podcast that when a woman's on the pill, her ovarian reserve parameters are suppressed and they are lower. And this has been consistently found in the research. And so it takes anywhere from 6 to 7 months minimum for those parameters to naturally rebound. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason is if you did have a history with period issues, cycle issues, then you do want to give yourself enough time in case you do have a delayed return of fertility. Women who have a history of long irregular cycles, skipping periods, missed ovulation, or amenorrhea are at a greater risk of experiencing a delay in the return of their fertility post-pill. And if you're in that category and you give yourself 18 months to 2 years, meaning that if you have the ability to come off of the pill early, and that means that you're coming off the pill when you're still avoiding pregnancy. And so it means that when you come off the pill, you're going to find another alternative, whether those are non-hormonal options, fertility awareness, or a combination. So I'm suggesting to come off the pill when you are still actively avoiding before you're actually ready to start trying, to give your body a chance to settle it, to go through this post-pill transition phase. And that allows you to see what's really going on. And so that's something to consider. And that goes against the advice that most women are given when they seek support from their physicians regarding whether or not they should consider coming off the pill early. And so moving to her experience coming off with her low AMH and being told that she's going to need donor eggs because that means she won't be able to conceive naturally. Again, that unfortunately is incorrect on two fronts. One, the pill does affect AMH and it's well studied. So it's in the research. So it's not really something that is up for debate. I mean, it's what the research tells us. And if you look at studies when these ovarian reserve parameters are measured while women are on contraceptives or shortly thereafter, then you'll consistently see that. And then the other issue is that AMH is not actually useful at predicting whether or not a woman will be able to conceive naturally, and it is most effective at predicting the success of IVF stimulation. So if the AMH is too low, then if she goes through the IVF stimulation, she will likely not stimulate well and not get a whole lot of eggs to use moving forward in that procedure. And if it's too high, then that would be an indication that she may overstimulate. And that's something that we see in women with PCOS. So that is a bit of a summary there of some of the topics that we talked about. And like I said, it's important to have these conversations because these details and facts and information are often not the same details and information that we're getting, unfortunately, from our primary care physicians and practitioners. All right. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.